Old School RuneScape has a problem it can't solve. Every few years, the game releases a weapon so powerful it warps everything around it. Players structure their entire accounts around getting it, bosses get designed assuming you have it, and when the next broken weapon arrives, the entire cycle starts over again. This isn't about picking one weapon and deciding that it's the most broken thing ever added to the game. It's about understanding a pattern that's been repeating since 2004. Each era of RuneScape has had a weapon that defined what optimal play looked like. Each time, the developers had to decide whether to nerf it, work around it, or let it reshape the game permanently. And each time, the choice they made set up the next crisis. We're going chronologically through every weapon that changed the meta. We'll see how the Abyssal Whip ruled for 10 years, and why that decade of dominance created problems the game still hasn't solved. How the toxic Blowpipe compressed an entire combat system into 2 ticks and forced the developers to choose between nerfing the game's most popular weapon or watching progression collapse. How mega rares like the Twisted Bow created a gear ceiling so high that normal progression stopped mattering to anyone who couldn't afford $1 billion gold. And how specialization weapons in 2024 completely replaced raw power with surgical precision, turning best in slot from one goal into 20 different goals. By the end, you'll understand why Old School RuneScape keeps producing broken weapons even when everyone knows it's a problem, because the truth is, the game can't survive without them. In the beginning, RuneScape's weapon meta was determined by one skill. If you could smith it, you could use it. Once you hit 99 smithing, you unlock the ability to make a rune two-handed sword. This weapon became the definitive free-to-play best in slot for years. Not because of complex mechanics or hidden interactions, but because it had the highest max hit available. The game didn't care about attack speed yet. It didn't care about accuracy. It only cared about knockout potential. But the rune two-handed sword wasn't broken in the way we think of broken weapons today. It didn't warp the meta because it was too powerful or too accessible. It dominated because nothing else existed at its tier. You either had access to it or you didn't. If you did, you won more fights. But if you didn't, you were at a disadvantage. The entire melee meta revolved around strength and nothing else. Faster weapons existed, but they dealt less damage per hit, and that's all anyone cared about. The simplicity created the template for every broken weapon that would follow. When one item is clearly the best and everyone knows it, experimentation dies. Players optimize towards the single strongest option. The game becomes less about choice and more about whether you've reached the threshold yet. The rune two-handed sword era taught RuneScape a lesson it would have to relearn over and over again. Dominance leads to stagnation. When the game transitioned to RuneScape 2 in 2004, the combat system changed. Weapon speed became a variable. The game introduced a 4-tick system that made faster weapons competitive even if their max hit was lower. The weapon that attacked twice as fast didn't need to hit twice as hard to keep pace. It just needed to deal enough damage over time. This opened the door for something new to take over. The Abyssal Whip required level 70 attack and attacked faster than almost any other weapon in the game. It had a high accuracy, high strength bonus, and a speed that let it deal more damage per second than weapons with higher max hits. For the first time, a weapon combined speed, accuracy, and power in a way that made slower weapons obsolete. The rune two-handed sword still hit harder on a single attack, but the whip hit more often, and that's what mattered. The whip became the standard melee weapon for nearly 10 years. It wasn't just the best option, it was the practical option for everything. You could train faster with it because its attack speed let you gain experience more quickly. You could kill bosses faster with it because sustained DPS mattered more than single hit damage. You could also use it to PK because its speed gave you more chances to land hits. It worked for every situation, and the developers didn't release anything stronger for years. This created a ceiling that couldn't be adjusted without breaking progression. When one weapon is best in slot for that long, the game stagnates in a different way than it did during the rune two-handed sword era. Players stop experimenting because trying alternatives means giving up performance. New melee weapons get ignored unless they're strictly better, which means the only way to add meaningful content is through power creep. The whip was so dominant that it became a prison for future design. What made the whip era particularly strange was that it lasted through massive changes to the rest of the game. Barrow's equipment was added in 2005, introducing degradable armor with set effects. The Grand Exchange was launched in 2007, completely changing how players traded items. God War's Dungeon came out in 2007, adding tier 75 weapons that should have replaced the whip, but the whip remained dominant because those tier 75 weapons were either too expensive, too slow, or too niche. The whip worked well enough for everything, which meant it was the only weapon most players ever needed. The Abyssal Whip taught RuneScape a different lesson than the Rune two-handed sword. The problem wasn't just that one weapon was best. The problem was that one weapon was best for too long. A decade of dominance meant that an entire generation of players structured their accounts around tier 70 attack. It meant that content was designed assuming players would use the whip. It meant that when Old School RuneScape launched in 2013, the game couldn't escape the whip's shadow even though it was starting over. When Old School RuneScape launched in February 2013, it used a backup from August 2007. This meant the game reset to the tier 70 era. The Abyssal Whip was best in slot again. Barrow's armor was best in slot again. God War's dungeon didn't exist yet. Players who had experienced higher tiers in the main game now had to accept a lower ceiling. For many players, this was exactly what they wanted. They missed the simplicity of the tier 70 meta, but the developers knew they couldn't keep the game frozen forever. Old School RuneScape needed new content to survive. Players would get bored of running the same bosses and using the same gear they'd been using since 2004. The question wasn't whether the game would add new items. The question was how to add them without breaking the balance that made Old School feel like Old School. The tier 70 ceiling became a philosophical boundary, not just a mechanical one. Every new item had to be justified. It had to feel like it belonged in a 2007 era game, even if it was being designed in 2013 or later. This created tension between players who wanted the game to stay exactly as it was and players who wanted it to evolve. The developers had to walk a line between preservation and progress, and they had to do it knowing that every new weapon risked becoming the next Abyssal Whip, dominating the meta for years and limiting future design. The early months of Old School RuneScape were quiet in terms of new gear. The game focused on reintroducing content that had existed in 2007 but wasn't in the backup. In September of 2013, the Nightmare Zone was added, which allowed players to imbue rings like the Berserker ring to double their strength bonuses. This was a small power increase, but it was safe because it didn't add a new tier. It just made existing items slightly better. The developers were being cautious. They remembered what happened when one weapon became too dominant, but caution only lasts so long. By October 2013, the game was ready to add something new, and that something would be the first real test of whether Old School RuneScape could introduce power creep without losing what made it old school. God War's dungeon launched in October 2013, only 8 months after Old School RuneScape went live. This was huge because it meant the game was already moving past the tier 70 ceiling. The dungeon introduced God Swords, which required 75 attack and had special attacks that could change fights instantly. The Armadillo God Sword could drain an opponent's stats and deal massive damage. The Saradaman God Sword could heal you while attacking. The Zamorak God Sword could freeze your target in place. These weren't just stronger weapons, they had utility that the whip couldn't match. But God Swords were also expensive and slow. They attacked at the same speed as the old Rune two-handed sword, which meant their DPS was lower than the whip in most situations. They cost tens of millions of gold, which put them out of reach for most players. And their special attacks consumed 50% of your special attack energy, which meant you couldn't spam them. God Swords filled a niche rather than replacing the whip entirely. They became the weapon you brought to bosses where burst damage mattered. The whip remained the weapon you used for everything else. This split created a healthier meta than the whip era had. Different weapons served different purposes. The whip was for training and sustained damage. God Swords were for bossing and PvP. Players had choices again. For a while, this felt sustainable. The developers had proven they could add higher tier weapons without invalidating existing gear. The tier 75 boundary seemed like a safe place to stop. Alongside God Swords, God War's dungeon introduced Bando's armor. This was a more subtle change, but it had a bigger long-term impact. Bando's chestplate and tassets had lower defense than Barrow's armor, but higher strength bonuses. Barrow's gave you 121 slash defense, Bando's gave you 98 slash defense, but Bando's gave you 4 strength, and Barrow's gave you 0. This introduced a trade-off that hadn't really existed before. You could choose survivability, or you could choose damage. In practice, damage won almost every time. Players realized that killing things faster meant taking less damage overall. Defensive stats only mattered if you were tanking hits for a long time, and most content didn't require that. Bandos became the new offensive standard, and Barrow's armor got relegated to niche tanking roles. This was the first sign that Old School RuneScape was drifting toward an offensive meta where raw damage output mattered more than anything else. The God Wars dungeon era proved that Old School RuneScape could add content without breaking the game. God swords were powerful but not dominant. Bando's armor was better than Barrow's, but not so much better that it invalidated everything before it. The developers had successfully raised the ceiling from tier 70 to tier 75 without collapsing the progression system. For about a year, the game felt balanced. Players were happy, the meta was diverse, but this balance didn't last, because in January 2015, the developers added a boss that would break everything the God Wars dungeon had carefully preserved, and the weapon that boss dropped would dominate the game for the next 6 years. Zulrah was a solo boss added in January 2015. It was designed to be accessible, profitable, and farmable. It dropped valuable resources like pure essence and magic logs, which made it worth killing even if you didn't get rare drops. And its rare drop table included a weapon called the Toxic Blowpipe. This weapon would go on to become the most broken item in Old School RuneScape history, not because of a single overpowered stat, but because of how it compressed the entire ranged combat system into something that couldn't be balanced. The Toxic Blowpipe attacked every 2 ticks instead of the standard 5 ticks for most ranged weapons. That alone made it fast, but it wasn't just fast. It also added the stats of whatever darts you loaded into it directly to its base stats. If you used dragon darts, which had high range strength, the Blowpipe added that strength to its own. This meant the weapon scaled with how much money you were willing to spend. Rich players could make it even more powerful by using expensive darts. The result was a weapon that dealt more damage per second than almost anything else in the game. It outperformed weapons that cost 10 times more. It made other ranged weapons irrelevant. The magic shortbow couldn't compete because it was slower. Crossbows couldn't compete because even with a shield, their DPS was lower. The Blowpipe became the default choice for Slayer, bossing, raids, and even some PvP situations. It worked everywhere, and it was cheap enough that mid-level players could afford it. This created the same problem the Abyssal Whip had created, but worse. The Whip dominated melee for 10 years, but at least it only dominated one combat style. The Blowpipe dominated ranged and pushed into content where melee or magic should have been better. Players stopped experimenting with different range setups because the Blowpipe was always the answer. YouTubers and streamers stopped showcasing alternate strategies because the Blowpipe was always faster. The meta compressed into a single question: do you have the Blowpipe yet? What made the Blowpipe truly broken wasn't just its power, it was the design trap it created. Because the Blowpipe was so dominant, the developers couldn't release new ranged weapons without making them even faster or even stronger. Every new ranged weapon had to be compared to the Blowpipe, and most of them lost. Crossbows stayed relevant only because they could use shields and had special bolt effects, but even that wasn't enough in most situations. The Blowpipe had become a bottleneck that prevented ranged combat from evolving, and player behavior changed in response. Rushing Zulrah became a priority for new accounts because the Blowpipe was mandatory for competitive play. Ironmen structured the progression around unlocking it as early as possible. Regular accounts farmed gold specifically to afford dragon darts. The weapon wasn't just best in slot, it was a requirement, and because it was a requirement, the developers started to design content with the assumption that players would have it. Monsters were given higher defense to counter the Blowpipe's speed. Bosses were designed with mechanics that ranged players could bypass more easily than melee players. This created a feedback loop where the Blowpipe became more necessary even as it made the game less interesting. The weapon had solved ranged combat so thoroughly that there was no room left for anything else. The meta had collapsed into a single point of optimization, and everyone knew it was a problem. But fixing it would mean nerfing the most popular weapon in the game, and that wouldn't happen for another 6 years. By 2021, the Toxic Blowpipe had been the best ranged weapon in the game for 6 years. It had shaped how every piece of ranged content worked. It had determined what counted as good TPS. It had become so central to the game that players couldn't imagine RuneScape without it, and that's exactly why the developers decided to nerf it. In June 2021, Jagex implemented what they called the equipment rebalance. The Toxic Blowpipe's accuracy accuracy dropped by roughly 30%. Its strength dropped by a similar amount. This wasn't just a small adjustment. This was one of the harshest nerfs in OSRS history. The community exploded. Players who had structured their entire accounts around the blowpipe felt betrayed. Reddit threads filled with complaints. YouTube videos predicted the death of ranged combat. The backlash was intense and immediate. But the blowpipe wasn't the only target. Black to hide armor lost a significant chunk of its magic defense because it provided too much protection for how cheap it was. A full set cost around 10,000 gold, but gave you magic defense comparable to much expensive gear. The nerf reduced those defensive stats by roughly 22 to 24%. Din's Bulwark, a massive shield from the chambers of Zerek raid, also got adjusted. It had been nearly impossible for PKers to land spells on players using it, so its magic defense got reduced while its melee defense got buffed. The developers were trying to restore some balance to the wilderness. One item almost got nerfed but didn't. The Knight Is Not face guard was an upgrade to the Helm of Knight Is Not that added a strength bonus. The initial proposal removed that strength bonus entirely. The community pushed back hard, arguing that quest rewards shouldn't be nerfed and that the item wasn't overpowered. The developers listened and reverted the change before it went live. This was rare. Most of the time, once a nerf was announced, it happened. The reasoning behind all these changes was the same. These items had compressed the meta. They had made other items obsolete. They had limited what the developers could add to the game without creating more power creep. The blowpipe nerf specifically was meant to create space for new ranged weapons. For years, every ranged weapon had to compete with a 2-tick monster that cost less than 1 million gold. That competition made it nearly impossible to design interesting ranged combat. After the nerf, the blowpipe was still usable, but it just wasn't mandatory anymore. Crossbows became worth using again. The Dragon Hunter crossbow started seeing more use at dragons. The Armadillo crossbow became a legitimate alternative for general bossing. Other ranged weapons that had been collecting dust in banks suddenly had a purpose. The game opened up in a way it hadn't for years, but the cost was steep. The trust between players and developers took a hit that it still hasn't fully recovered from. Players now knew that their best in slot gear could be changed at any time, which made long-term investments feel less secure. What the equipment rebalance proved was that broken weapons don't just warp the present, they warp the future. Every piece of content designed around the blowpipe had to be reconsidered. Every boss with high defense that assumed players had the pre-nerf blowpipe suddenly became harder. The developers had spent 6 years building around a broken weapon, and fixing that weapon meant confronting 6 years of accumulated design decisions. But the nerf was necessary, and it revealed just how deeply one weapon had shaped the entire game. While the blowpipe was dominating mid-level and general content, another weapon was quietly reshaping the high end of the game. The Twisted Bow came from the Chambers of Zerek raid, which launched in January 2017. This weapon had a unique mechanic. Its damage and accuracy scaled with the target's magic level. Against enemies with low magic, it was mediocre, but against bosses with high magic, it was the best weapon in the game by a massive margin. The scaling mechanic created a strange situation. Some bosses became Twisted Bow bosses. If you were fighting Zulrah, Commander Ziliana, or any of the Theater of Blood bosses, the Twisted Bow was the optimal choice. If you were fighting something with low magic, the weapon was almost useless. This binary performance meant the Twisted Bow didn't compress the meta the way the blowpipe did. It was overpowered in specific situations and underwhelming everywhere else. But this created its own problem. Any new boss with high magic automatically became a Twisted Bow boss. The developers couldn't design high magic encounters without the Twisted Bow warping them, and if they wanted to make a boss where the Twisted Bow wasn't dominant, they had to give that boss low magic, which limited how the boss could be designed. The weapon didn't dominate everything, but it constrained what was possible in endgame content. The price barrier made the Twisted Bow different from other broken weapons. For years, it cost over 1 billion gold. Most players couldn't afford it. This created two separate games. Players with a Twisted Bow experienced certain content as easy and profitable, while players without it experienced that same content as difficult and slow. The gap between rich players and everyone else widened significantly. The weapon that was overpowered but inaccessible created a different set of problems than a weapon that was overpowered and cheap. The Twisted Bow also introduced the concept of mega rares. These were items so rare and so expensive that they defined the absolute top end of gear progression. Before the Twisted Bow, the most expensive items in the game cost maybe 100 to 200 million gold. The Twisted Bow cost 5 to 10 times that. It created a new tier of wealth that most players players would never reach. And once that tier existed, the developers could add more items to it without worrying as much about accessibility. If only the richest players could afford these items anyway, making them powerful wasn't as disruptive to the average player's experience. In June 2018, the Theater of Blood raid introduced the Scythe of Vitter. This was a tier 80 melee weapon that hit up to 3 targets at once in a 1x3 area. When fighting groups of enemies or large bosses with multiple hittable tiles, it effectively dealt triple damage. This made it the best melee weapon in the game for specific content, but it came with a cost. The Scythe consumed blood runes with every attack, making it expensive to use. The Scythe wasn't universally broken like the Blowpipe had been. It was situationally broken. Against Verzik Vitur in Theater of Blood, the Scythe was the clear best option. Against the Abyssal Sire, which had multiple targets you could hit at once, the Scythe dominated. Against Cerberus, the Scythe hit both the main boss and its summoned souls. But against single target enemies that only occupied one tile, the Scythe was just an expensive alternative to the Abyssal Whip or other weapons. This introduced a new idea to OSRS. Best in slot wasn't one item anymore. It was a collection of items for different situations. Players now needed multiple endgame weapons to be competitive everywhere. If you wanted to be optimal at raids, you needed the Twisted Bow for ranged and the Scythe for melee. That's 2 items worth over $1 billion gold each. The cost of playing at the highest level had increased dramatically. The Scythe also established a pattern that future mega rares would follow. Make the item extremely powerful in specific scenarios. Make it rare enough that it stays expensive. Balance its power with an upkeep cost so players can't use it everywhere without losing money. This formula allowed the developers to add powerful items without completely breaking the game. The items were overpowered, but they were overpowered in controlled ways that only affected players who could afford them. What the Scythe era showed was that specialization could be used as a form of power creep control. If every new weapon was the best at something specific rather than the best at everything, players would need to collect multiple weapons instead of finding one weapon that solved everything. This was horizontal progression in theory, but in practice, it just meant the endgame became more expensive. You weren't choosing between the Twisted Bow and the Scythe, you were grinding until you had both. For most of OSRS history, magic had been the weakest combat style at high levels. Magic was useful for utility spells and some niche content, but it couldn't compete with ranged or melee for sustained damage. That changed in August 2022 when the Tombs of Amascot raid introduced Tumakin's Shadow. This weapon tripled your magic level for damage calculations that came with built-in accuracy buffs. Against certain bosses, it became the best weapon in the game regardless of your combat style. Tumakin's Shadow was expensive to use. It consumed Chaos runes, Death runes, and Soul runes with every cast. At max efficiency, using this weapon could cost hundreds of thousands of gold per hour, but the DPS it provided was worth it. At Verzik Vitur, Tumakin's Shadow outperformed even the Scythe. At the Phantom Muspa, it was the clear best option. Magic finally had a weapon that could stand alongside the Twisted Bow and Scythe at the top of the game. The problem was that Tumakin's Shadow followed the same formula. It was extremely powerful, extremely rare, and extremely expensive. The weapon cost billions of gold. Like the Twisted Bow and Scythe before it, it was locked behind content that most players would never complete and a price tag that most players would never afford. The gap between wealthy players and everyone else continued to widen. By late 2022, the high end of OSRS had become a collection of mega rares that each cost more than players could ever earn. If you wanted to be optimal, you needed the Twisted Bow for range, the Scythe for melee, and Tumakin's Shadow for magic. That's 3 items worth over 3 billion gold combined, and that wasn't counting the armor, jewelry, and other gear you needed to support them. The endgame had become a goal that was functionally unreachable for the average player. What all 3 mega rares had in common was that they solved problems for players who already had everything. If you could afford a Twisted Bow, you probably didn't need the money it helped you earn. The weapons were powerful enough to be worth grinding for, but they were also so expensive that grinding for them required thousands of hours. They represented the absolute peak of progression, but that peak kept getting higher and further away. In July 2023, Desert Treasure 2 introduced 4 new rings that replaced items that had been best in slot since 2013. For 10 years, imbued rings from the Nightmare Zone had been the standard. The Berserker ring gave +8 melee strength, the Seer's ring gave +3 magic attack, the Archer's ring gave +8 ranged attack. These rings were cheap, accessible, and good enough that nobody questioned them. Desert Treasure 2 changed that overnight. The new rings were massive upgrades. The Ultra ring gave gave plus 12 melee strength compared to the Berserker ring's plus 8. That's 4 extra strength, which translated to roughly 1 to 2 extra max hits depending on your other gear. The Magus ring gave plus 15 magic attack and 2% magic damage. The Bellator ring gave plus 20 splash attack and plus 6 strength. The Venator ring gave plus 10 ranged attack and plus 2 ranged strength. These weren't small improvements. These were the kind of upgrades that changed how fast you could kill bosses. The problem though was accessibility. These rings required completing Desert Treasure 2, which was one of the hardest quests in the game. Then you needed to fight 4 new bosses to get the materials to make them. These bosses were designed for endgame players with high stats and good gear. Mid-level players couldn't access these rings even though the old imbued rings they replaced had been accessible to almost everyone. The gear ceiling had risen again and the floor hadn't moved with it. The rings also weren't cheap. They cost tens of millions of gold each. The Altar ring has stayed above 100 million gold for a long time because it was mandatory for any serious melee setup. Players who couldn't afford it or couldn't beat the required bosses were stuck with the old rings, which suddenly felt inadequate. The gap between high-level players and mid-level players widened again. What made the ring update particularly significant was that it touched every build. The Berserker ring had been part of the game since 2005. It had been imbued in 2013. For 18 years, that ring had been the melee standard. Replacing it meant changing a piece of the meta that had been stable for nearly 2 decades. The Desert Treasure 2 rings proved that even the oldest and most established items could be replaced if the developers decided the power ceiling needed to rise. By late 2024, OSRS had been adding specialized weapons for years. Dragonbane weapons like the Dragon Hunter Lance and Dragon Hunter Crossbow dealt extra damage against dragons. The Inquisitor's armor set boosted crush weapons. But these specializations were usually small bonuses. You used Dragonbane weapons at dragons because they were slightly better, not because they were necessary. That changed with the introduction of Demonbane weapons. Emberlight was a direct upgrade to Arclight, a weapon that had existed since 2016. Arclight provided a 70% accuracy and damage boost against demons. Emberlight kept that bonus but added infinite charges, higher base stats, and better attack speed. Against demons, Emberlight outperformed even the Scythe of Bitter. At Duke Susselis, Emberlight dealt 11.45 DPS compared to the Scythe's 10.93 DPS. At Cerberus, Emberlight dealt 10.86 DPS while the Scythe dealt 9.68 DPS. A weapon that cost a fraction of the price was beating a multi-billion gold mega rare. The Scorching Bow did the same thing for ranged. It was a Demonbane ranged weapon that provided similar bonuses against demons. In Kirill Sutsaroth in the God Wars dungeon, the Scorching Bow outperformed most other ranged weapons. It had a special attack that could root demons in place, which made it useful for both damage and utility. Like Emberlight, it was relatively easy to obtain compared to mega rares, but extremely powerful in its niche. These weapons fundamentally changed what best in slot meant. Against demons, Emberlight and the Scorching Bow were best in slot. Against dragons, the Dragon Hunter weapons were best in slot. Against general content, mega rares were still best in slot. Players now needed different gear and different content. You couldn't just save up for one weapon that solved everything. You needed to collect multiple specialized weapons to be optimal everywhere. The shift to specialization solved one problem but created another. Demonbane weapons were accessible enough that mid-level players could compete with high-level players at demon bosses. An Iron Man with Emberlight could match the DPS of a main account with a Scythe at Duke Susselis. This was good for accessibility, but it also meant that playing optimally required farming multiple specialized weapons instead of saving for one universal upgrade. Your bank needed to hold weapons for demons, dragons, general content, and whatever other specializations the game added in the future. By 2026, best in slot had become contextual. There was no single answer to what weapon you should use. It depended on what you were fighting. This made the game more complex and potentially more interesting, but it also made progression less clear. New players couldn't just work toward getting the Abyssal Whip anymore. They needed to understand which weapons were best for which content and grind out multiple options. The simplicity that had defined early OSRS was gone. Every few years, Old School RuneScape releases a weapon that becomes mandatory for competitive play. The Abyssal Whip lasted 10 years, the Toxic Blowpipe lasted 6, the Mega Rare era lasted about 4 years before specialization weapons weapons started replacing them, but each cycle is getting shorter because the game has to keep adding content to survive, and new content needs rewards that matter. Old School RuneScape is built on a promise of preservation. The game exists because players wanted to keep playing a version of RuneScape that felt like 2007, but preservation requires stasis, and stasis kills MMOs. Players get bored, they run out of goals, they move on to other games. The only way to keep players engaged is to add new content, and new content needs rewards. The developers tried to manage this through polling. Every major update goes through a player vote, and if 75% of players approve, the update gets added. If not, it doesn't. This system was supposed to prevent the game from changing too much or too fast, but polling doesn't solve power creep. Players vote for powerful rewards because powerful rewards are exciting. They vote against nerfs because nerfs feel bad. The system is biased towards adding power and against removing it. The concept of horizontal progression was supposed to solve this. New weapons would be situationally better rather than universally better. Players would collect different tools for different jobs instead of chasing one best weapon. And this works in theory, but players optimize. If a weapon is best for any content that matters, it becomes mandatory for that content. Horizontal progression only works if players accept suboptimal choices, and most players don't. The history of RuneScape's most broken weapons isn't about individual items. It's about a game trying to preserve itself while also evolving, about developers trying to balance what players want with what the game needs, about a community that wants new content but doesn't want things to change. These contradictions can't be resolved. They can only be managed, and the weapons we've looked at today are the evidence of that management, successful or not. The Rune two-handed sword taught the game that simple systems break fast. The Abyssal Whip taught it that dominance has costs. The Toxic Blowpipe taught it that accessibility plus power equals compression. The Mega Rares taught it that price barriers create two games. Specialization weapons taught it that content can replace universality, but at the cost of complexity. Each lesson led to the next broken weapon. Each solution set up the next problem. That's the real story here. Not which weapon was the most broken, but why they keep breaking, why the game keeps producing them, why the cycle repeats, and why every fix is temporary and every solution creates new problems.